Hello YouTube, back for an AEW Dynamite review for March 15th, 2023 from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Took off last week because I figured coming off the pay-per-view there wasn't anything necessarily that I need to cover, but we're back this week for what was a decent show. I want to say that certain things did move forward, certain things did happen. It's not that nothing happened, but it's one of those things where more potential has been opened up, some questions have certainly been opened up. I do appreciate certain elements though of the show that happened through it, so let's get right into it. It started off right off the top with a very sports entertainment-y segment, but that has, again, some potential. It was the MJF re-bar mitzvah. So they made a whole big deal, started off with the whole thing of MJF coming out, and he got the girls and makes out with one of the girls, and they're doing this whole thing. He's got streamers, he's got balloons, and it's going to be a big, elaborate reason for him to give his promo in this whole 9 yards. Very much an MJF production. Now, I will say about midway through the celebration, he's interrupted by Jungle Boy, which gets a great reaction because in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, the Canadian crowds are generally very strong for wrestling, especially if you're giving them their first taste. So it tends to be pretty good. And this crowd was very strong for a lot of this show. And you definitely got a taste of it early on here with this segment. So Jungle Boy comes out to a great reaction from the crowd, and he's about to start talking, and then Sammy Guevara comes out. You know, he gets a lot of boos, but again, he comes out. And then, as he's starting to talk, then you get a Darby Allin coming out, again, to a great reaction. So now you've got the four pillars of AEW, you know, kind of their visual. And it was interesting that I do kind of enjoy the fact that they're coming up, I think it's this year coming up here in the 4th anniversary of AEW. And I think it's very appropriate that the four guys that are named the four pillars, very similar to the four horsewomen in WWE in the way that they kind of skirted around that a million times, but never managed to get a specific match on the main roster. Well, AEW here just put the visual of the four pillars of AEW, the four young guys who comprise of the early success of the company and the homegrown talent, so to speak. Well, this was an opportunity for them to kind of showcase the possibility with three of them laying claim to the idea of having a title shot against MJF not wanting to do it and trying to run them down and each of them cutting them off in sequence. So all of them got to interrupt him at different times. So that's kind of what made things a bit interesting. And they all kind of aired some grievances. Now, this is where I think this segment was a little bit interesting. It was a bit sports entertainment-ish, mixed in with a little bit of AEW's enjoying of kind of playing into the reality. You had Darby Allin playing the role. This was interesting to me. You had Darby Allin playing the role of the guy, of the homegrown talent who's happy with his, circumstances, complaining about the other wrestlers who spend time on social media complaining about this, that, and the other thing, and looking for the possibility of maybe going back to WWE and all that. He kind of represented it, even with a little bit of a whiny voice. Look, I'll just put it this way. This is probably the most personality that Darby Allin has had his entire AEW run. Obviously, he's got his charisma, and he's also willing to, kill himself. So maybe it's to his detriment, speaking of being a bad businessman. But the point is that this is at least a little bit of entertainment value, and MJF had some decent points where he threw in that all the other guys had a little bit of different support, but at the same time, MJF has gotten a lot of opportunities. And I do enjoy, and this was, again, where a lot of this segment I thought was very interesting. I kind of sat back and watched it, and I thought it was an interesting angle for them all to take. Because you even had Sammy Guevara almost playing it straight. Given that he has a title match coming up in the main event of this show, it is kind of interesting having Sammy Guevara play it straight, the idea that he had to kind of scrape and claw to get to that position. The fact that he was brought in kind of as a guy to be kind of a jabroni for, Jericho early on. And you had Jungle Boy playing off the fact that he got certain opportunities. They had one encounter and then they went off in divergent directions. And then you had Darby Allin also kind of playing into his side of things. And it was just kind of interesting the way they juxtaposed it with MJF. And Jungle Boy made the point that MJF had never had a match on Dark or Elevation or one of the other ones. So he kind of got to, avoid, even Rampage, which actually I didn't know that. I hadn't even realized it until he brought it up. I would like somebody to fact check that. But I'd be curious if, in fact, MJF has never made an appearance on Rampage, which is funny because that means that technically for his entire run in AEW, he has never not been on the flagship show or pay-per-view, which is kind of interesting. I think that's kind of an interesting little twist. But again, it gave them all some legitimate sounding grievances. I don't know if that results in them getting a match, but at least the visual of it and the implication of it I thought was interesting. So to start off the show, I guess it was interesting, although it did eventually break down into the guys fighting and then MJF getting launched and falling onto his cake for a little bit of a comedic spot in it. I don't know what's going to come of this one, but at least it was interesting. I'll give it that. It was an interesting way to start the show. Next up, you got Hangman and the Dark Order taking on the Blackpool Combat Club. A bit of an interesting one. It was obviously going to be the continuation of this feud. It just keeps kind of rolling on, and we'll talk about it a little bit more towards the end of the show. It was very physical. There was a nice showcase of Stu Grimson, who technically is no longer with AEW, So it is kind of interesting that they would have this much for Stu Grimson, given they did the same thing during his last Canadian appearance as well. But it's one of those things where, like, if you want Stu Grimson to be part of this group, then put Stu Grimson back in the group. You have to come up with some kind of a deal that makes sense. It was kind of a weird thing. But anyway, Stu Grimson had a great showcase for himself. The Blackpool Combat Club wins by knocking Hangman out with the bell via Wheeler Yuta. And then the other Dark Order members try to fight, and then they end up losing based on a choke out of Stu Grimson. At that point, the Blackpool Combat Club starts assaulting them. They try to fight back, and they're beat down. And then the rest of the Dark Order comes in to make the save post-match. And Hangman, like I said, was knocked out during this, and it'll come into play a little bit later on. Next up here I've got on the list is the Jade Cargill Canadian Open Challenge. So you got a special emphasis on that. That was answered by Nicole Matthews, who's a Canadian professional wrestler who can apparently take American dates, so that was the thing. Defeated fairly quickly. Another bit of a squash match leading to Jade moving to 54-0. And then she starts a promo in which she complains about the lack of competition, etc., which then prompts Taya Valkyrie coming out. Now, what's good about this, I guess, is that you do have an interesting juxtaposition here. So number one, Taya Valkyrie at least is somebody different for her to face. So great. Good on that. And I didn't realize it. Now, mind you, it might be the shoes having really, really thick soles on it. But Taya Valkyrie, at least with the shoes on that she had on, basically looks at Jade basically eye to eye, which allows it to be more of a visual. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier, where in my mind, it would have always been Chris Statlander that would have made sense to be probably the one to knock Jade off. And it could still very well be. The point is, though, you needed somebody like that. You needed somebody like Chris Statlander or Killian King if they had been able to come to some kind of a deal and she had stayed on with AEW. Again, she does make appearances here and there, but it's one of those things where if she was a regular, she is somebody who physically could match up with Jade and look the part. Or like a Camille from NWA, somebody who has the physical stature to seem eye to eye with Jade to give her a credible opponent. Well, in this case, Taya Valkyrie looks physically about the same size, at least in terms of height, at least with those shoes on. And then in the end, it resulted in Layla Gray being hit with I think it's the Ride to Valhalla. I forget how the finisher is called with Taya Valkyrie's gimmick, but it's something like the Ride to Valhalla. But it's basically the same move that Jade uses. So that's kind of the emphasis point of it. And she had been doing it already for years. So it's kind of perfect that it kind of plays into the battle of the finishers that are identical. So I guess from that perspective, at least we were able to set up the next opponent for Jade. Hopefully they decide to build it up over a couple of weeks and don't immediately throw it onto television right away. I would like to see it build towards this match because at least then you're having something resembling a feud leading into a Jade title defense. Now, next up here, you got a bit of a sports entertainment segment again. So you got the debut of QTV, TMZ ripoff, but there they are. It reveals that QT was involved in Wardlow's stuff being stolen, and I did like that Solo had a bit of a joke because they asked, what's next with Wardlow? The whole thing was running down Wardlow. And they talked about what's next for Wardlow, and then Solo is in there with like, whatever is next for Batista, but worse. I'm paraphrasing, but that's effectively it. I'm like, oh, Batista joke. Jeez. Oh, man. Brutal. I will say, though, I did enjoy that one of them, I want to say it's QT, maybe one of the other people, did talk about how Wardlow's momentum had been stolen. Maybe, I want to say it was MJF, or regardless, they referenced that Wardlow's momentum had been stolen, which is kind of true. Unfortunately, kind of true. Although it did lead me to a bit of a thought. So let me get into the next match and I'll kind of share with you a thought that I have coming off of this. I will say the last line from Hobbs in this was fine. And they're going to do an open challenge with the TNT Championship, which again, also fine. The open challenges for the TNT Championship are fine. But I do have a bit of a thought that this leads me to coming off of the next match. So the next match was actually Orange Cassidy taking on Jeff Jarrett for the newly dubbed International Championship, formerly the All Atlantic Championship. Now, we've talked about, now real quick, bottom line, the match was fine. Jeff Jarrett is still solid in the ring. He can get the job done. Orange Cassidy's very good. It was a decent match for the most part and then ended in a bunch of shenanigans. Orange Cassidy did end up winning. Even though Saddam Singh interfered, even though there was a referee bump, even though Aubrey Edwards had to throw them out. So it was a bunch of shenanigans all over the place leading eventually to Orange Cassidy pulling it out and retaining the championship and remaining the international champion. The matches with Orange Cassidy, for the most part, are good with this championship. The championship itself has been fine, but this leads me to the thought that I'm having coming off the QTV segment. I think a lot of the lineage of the TNT Championship has received a lot of damage. At this point, really, if we're really being honest with ourselves, in the International Championship, even though they whipped it together and came out of left field, I would say the International Championship, quote unquote, has got a much stronger, brief lineage than the TNT Championship currently. Unfortunately, since the passing of Brody Lee and a lot of the tributes and everything that came of it, the TNT Championship never regained its momentum. Like, it just kind of lagged at that point. It became just this belt that different people would hold, but it never kind of led anywhere. It's one of those things where it's just unfortunate the way it worked out. I don't know if it would have been different if he had, if Brody Lee was still around. But regardless, the championship just never, it became kind of generic. And also, just honestly, from a visual standpoint, forget about the lineage of the championship. From a visual standpoint, you look at the TNT championship, I understand why it exists, but now we've got this international championship. The TNT championship in some ways was the television championship, so to speak. It became a secondary belt. But if you look at the international championship, it looks more like a proper belt. And it hasn't been tainted by a lot of the hot potatoing of the championship. Sammy Guevara is a 3-time TNT champion. Cody Rhodes was a multi-time TNT champion. So there was all these. Oh, and Wardlow, of course, was a multi-time TNT champion, even though the second title reign was basically 3 days. The end result is we've had a lot of champions for that belt. And as comparison, the international championship has obviously just had a handful. I was about to say just Orange Cassidy, but that's not true. I think we had Pac and then we had Orange Cassidy. But regardless, that's at least a solid start. And both guys could obviously go. I almost feel like, and this is just my opinion, this is not a prediction, but I almost feel like it would be well served to unify these championships at some point. Just have a unification match and have somebody go with it going forward as the AEW International Champion, aka their version of the Intercontinental title, and just put your effort behind that instead of having multiple titles running around. And obviously you got all the ROH titles, but if it's being held mostly on ROH, it's perfectly fine. But on AEW television, I really do feel like, especially with the Trios Championship and the Tag Team Championship, you could probably get away with just having the International Championship comprising that secondary title and just doing away with the TNT Championship unless you've got a really good reason for it to exist. The TBS Championship on the women's side, at least that makes sense because then they have a secondary championship. I'm fine with it. I don't need any additional championships on the women's side. We're good with having a world title and a secondary title, but the TNT Championship is kind of falling into that no man's land. Right now, at this point, it's marginally better than the FTW Championship, and the FTW Championship is not even supposed to be a real championship. There's one too many in there, and if we're going to choose at this point, I would make the International Championship the Survivor if it was up to me. That's the way I would position it, but I'll leave it to AEW to figure that one out. But I think that's something that might be worth considering. Now, next up, the Outcasts come out to the ring with a new entrance. So you've got Ruby Soho, Toni Storm, and Saraya coming out. New entrance, new Titantron, the whole thing. Now they're the Outcasts, so they've been dubbed as such. Now, here's what's interesting. Correctly, Ruby Soho starts off with the in-ring promo. Now it's also an in-ring promo. So automatically, for all the complaints about it, and I'll say, it's not being executed as brilliantly as I would hope so. But again, beggars can't be choosers here. AEW really struggles with these types of storylines and really figuring out how to move it forward. And this segment, by the way, didn't really move it forward that much, but I'll talk about it here in a second. The point is, though, it's already a step in the right direction that at least they got this segment, and it's a step in the right direction that this segment resulted in an in-ring promo. Just by having an in-ring promo, and if nothing else, at least it got more in-ring promos than a lot of than the women's segments have had in forever. Everything else is usually backstage pre-tapes. So the fact they were able to let them do it live and the crowd was into it and able to work with it, that was good. So the end result is they ran down the division. Eventually, Britt Baker and Jamie Hayter come out to basically confront them and fight them. They start fighting them. Then the numbers, 3-2, start going against them. They get beat down for a little bit. And then in to make the save is Willow, Sky Blue, and Riho, the 3 women who had got run down during the promo, which makes sense. But right now, it doesn't look like a very strong team. You've got Saraya, Toni Storm, and you've got Ruby Soho as the invading force, so to speak. But this didn't really advance anything forward. They just kind of ran them down and kind of repeated what they had already been saying. And one thing that is kind of true is that, funny enough, they've done an okay job trying to retroactively come up with justification. Toni Storm has justification because she was not respected as champion and treated as an interim champion, even though she probably should have just been the champion. I agree with that. And her justification that when she lost the title and, Jamie Hayter cheated to beat her, the crowd cheered. Her being bitter about that makes sense, logically. Ruby Soho coming out and, having all these moments and then them cheering the other person. Her being embittered by that actually makes a lot of sense. Saraya, though, has no real excuse. She was basically, the red carpet was rolled out for her right at the beginning. And, she's kind of just pseudo leading this faction that supposedly is bitter, even though the other two have legitimate stake to being bitter. And she does not. She got a contract and they're letting her wrestle where the other company would not let her wrestle. If anything, she should be thankful to AEW. So her side of it doesn't really make nearly as much sense as the other two. The other two actually make a lot of sense. Regardless, it was fine. The only issues that I have are the fact that Saraya's side of it still doesn't make a lot of sense. It hasn't been fleshed out. This didn't really advance it forward. Having Willow, Sky Blue, and Riho kind of stand up for themselves is fine. Having the weird kind of pseudo alliance with, Britt Baker and Jamie Hayter is also kind of fine for now, at least because I don't expect it to get resolved next week. Let it run, continue running. But one other point that I will make to this that is kind of interesting is that this is where AEW gets a little bit lazy on this stuff. And it is that Britt Baker literally was the queen of sneak attacks and various things. And at this point, it's like the joke is that when somebody becomes a babyface, they become dumber. All of a sudden, did she forget how to cheat? Did she forget how to be underhanded? Did she forget how to find, like, at this point, they should the Outcast should not be waltzing around anywhere they want. Jamie Hayter and Britt Baker should literally be attacking them with pipes somewhere, like in the parking lot or something. Like, come up with a plan. You got the AEW Women's Champion and a former AEW Women's Champion, and between the two of you, you cannot come up with a cunning plan to defeat these three, at least for 1 week. Again, it should be back and forth between them, but the point is come up with a cunning plan of some kind, and that'll advance the ball forward, and then eventually lead you to your match, whatever it's going to end up being, blood and guts or anything else, like something. Like I said, this segment was just kind of kill time. I'm happy it was an in-ring promo, that's good, but everything else, I have questions. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, moving on, we get into the main event. It was the Jericho Appreciation Society versus the Elite versus the House of Black, aka Winnipeg wants to see Jericho and Kenny Omega in the ring, and those dastardly House of Blackians will not allow it. Damn them. Damn them. It was fun. It was the crowd was definitely into it. It was a lot of fun. Everybody got their entrances. It was good. And the crowd was definitely 100% into it, sang along with the Jericho song, was into the Elite entrance with Kenny Omega. And they did have a couple of segments where they teased, a couple of spots there where they teased Jericho and Kenny Omega really going at it. They eventually did get a couple of spots to do that. In the end, the House of Black retained, which is good. And the show ended. Unfortunately, my PVR froze, so I had to check out the result of that last little piece. So after the House of Black retained, following the result of the match, you've got the brawl between Hangman Page and the Blackpool Combat Club, continuing. And then it results in Page standing between the Blackpool Combat Club and his former friends in the Elite. They've alluded to the kiss, whether they would get together with the Elite again or not. That's kind of the continuation of it. So again, you've got some of the seeds of a potential storyline and something going forward. That's why I say this show is a bit of a mixed bag. There were some elements of it that were continuing in a holding pattern, like the women's side of things didn't really technically advance. You sort of did, but you didn't really. Again, you sowed a little bit of a seed, but you kind of stalled on the other part of it. This other piece is sowing the potential seed to some possibilities down the road here. We've got the Powerhouse Hobbs thing now with his new title and doing an open challenge. And then do we see Wardlow here down the road? That's a possibility. We've got this international championship and whatever Orange Cassidy is going to do with it. Again, it's kind of a championship without a specific storyline. And then you've got the TNT championship, which just came off sort of a storyline, but it was very quickly thrown together. You've got a new champion who probably needs the momentum. And again, we've got one too many titles there. Overall, though, a really good show because at the end of the day, the crowd was into it. And the matches that were there were interesting. And you had enough of the entertainment segments to go along with some of the wrestling ones that I felt like it was a well-balanced show, even though not everything hit. But I think that's going to be one of those things where not everything's going to hit every time. And in fact, this one did not hit in every aspect of it. But I was comfortable enough that enough stuff at least advanced forward that, okay, we can move on. And obviously the Canadian crowds really helped it. And I think that's funny that I saw earlier today that it looks like AEW is going to be making a whole summer swing through Canada, even hitting up Saskatoon. We're hitting up Saskatchewan. That's how serious. I guess Tony Khan is now a huge fan of Canada now that they can get some strong reactions to some of these places, including the Forbidden Door show, which I'll talk about maybe some more down the road here. The Forbidden Door show happening in Toronto at the Scotiabank place. So they're going to the bigger arena. So that's going to be very interesting. Probably some more things to say about that. Anyway, overall, I was pretty happy with the show. Again, it's not a perfect show. None of them are perfect shows. I'll give it a B-. I felt like it was a decent show. It did advance certain things. The Taya Valkyrie appearance was good. It gave Jade a more clear-cut next opponent, which is wonderful. But, in the meantime of this faction warfare, though, the AEW Women's Championship is kind of in flux because they got to see what they're going to do with that whole bit. And if they start building up their little factions and moving forward with that, I'd like to have seen a little bit more. But again, the fact that the promo was in the ring is a step in the right direction. The fact that the brawl and everything happened in the ring is a step in the right direction. So I'd like to at least see touches of that as we go forward. And they're really going to have to make use out of that Rampage. There is some interesting stuff on Rampage, but I generally don't talk about it. Maybe I'll try to find some time this weekend to talk about Rampage a little bit, just because they are incorporating some elements of it, but they're going to have to get into the habit of doing that more often. And I think that's really going to help them a lot in the long run. And that's, I think, going to be the key to making sure that they actually advance it forward. Because there are potential things they can do with it, but they got to treat it like that extra hour, because the rumor going around that they're going to get another hour potentially on a Saturday. I got questions for that unless you got a much better plan with what you're doing currently. Anyway, that's it for my review. AEW Dynamite from March the 15th, 2023. Now we'll see how they build as they start heading towards their next show. I don't think it's Forbidden Door. I think it's going to be Double or Nothing before that, and then the Forbidden Door after that. But regardless, we're going to be working our way towards the next big show. Curious what your thoughts are on this one. Feel free to throw that in the comments section. Appreciate it as always. We'll get more videos up on the channel. Like if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much. We'll catch you in the next one.